My name is Layla, and I'm 64 years old. I live in a small apartment in Seattle with a view of a small park. The neighborhood is quiet in its own way, though occasionally I wonder if the silence has become a little too familiar. My husband, Rash, and I have been married for almost 40 years, and our children have grown up, moved across the country, and started their own families. They occasionally visit, but most days it's just me, the hum of the apartment, and the rhythm of my daily prayers. Please remember to subscribe to my channel so I can continue to bring you more amazing true stories like this one. Rashi travels a lot for his job. Though I'm proud of his accomplishments, his absence leaves me with extended periods of time alone. I try to make the most of my days by reading, cooking, and volunteering at the mosque, but sometimes the hours seem too long, and as I get older, I find myself yearning for something I can't quite define. He is a respected scholar in our community who is frequently asked to lead seminars or speak at conferences. For years, I've told myself that life should be calm, predictable, and safe. However, I've buried that part of myself under the weight of responsibilities, but every now and then it comes back to me. One rainy afternoon, as I sat by the window, watching the rain streak down the glass, my phone buzzed with a message from Rashid's cousin in Chicago, someone I hadn't heard from in years. The message was brief, but unexpected. Salam Layla. No, my son Zaid is passing through Seattle for a few days. Would it be possible for him to stay with you while he's in town? I paused for a moment. The idea of having a guest took me by surprise, but it felt impolite to say no. Besides, it might be nice to have some company. So I replied, of course he's welcome to stay. The next evening, Zaid arrived. I opened the door to find a young man standing there with a travel bag on his shoulder. He was tall with broad shoulders and an athletic build that suggested a life full of activity. His skin was a warm brown, and his dark eyes had a quiet, confident look. Assalamu alaikum. Annie, he said, his voice deep yet gentle. Alaykum salam, I replied, smiling as I stepped aside to let him in. Zaid was polite, soft-spoken, and had a charm that was impossible to ignore. Over at dinner, Zaid told me about his studies, his dream of starting a business one day, and the travels that had brought him to Seattle. He spoke with so much passion and energy that it reminded me of the excitement I used to feel when I was younger. As the evening went on, I found myself watching him more closely than I had planned. The way he moved his hands while talking, about the warmth of his smile and the strength in his hands as he lifted his glass, all of it caught my attention in a way that left me feeling uneasy. When he excused himself to shower after dinner, I found myself staying in the living room, my mind racing. I told myself it was normal to admire a young man in his prime, but there was a part of me that felt guilty, as if I had crossed some invisible line. When Zaid came back, his hair was still damp from the shower. He thanked me again for letting him stay. You've been so kind, Aunt, he said, his voice soft. It's nice to feel. His words stuck with me long after I went to bed that night. As I lay awake listening to the rain tapping against the window, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that something had changed, something that hadn't been there in years. At home, even when I'm far from it, I smile. It had been so long since anyone had stayed with us, and Zaid's charm made it easy to forget how empty the apartment had often felt. However, as the days passed, I began to notice things that made me question my own thoughts. His presence filled the quiet spaces that had once felt so heavy, and his energy brought life to the apartment in a way I hadn't realized was missing. He was always courteous and thoughtful, offering to help with the dishes or asking about my day. But more than that, there was a warmth about him that seemed to brighten every room he entered. It was the way his voice carried when he spoke, deep and steady, with a certain quiet confidence that made you want to listen. He leaned back on the couch relaxedly with his long legs stretched out in front of him, and I couldn't help but notice how his shirt fit against his chest, revealing the lean muscles underneath. I hope I'm not intruding too much, Annie, he said, his dark eyes meeting mine. You've been so generous letting me stay. Not at all, I replied quickly, my voice a little too eager. It's been nice having someone around. His shoulders moved when he carried his bag upstairs, and his genuine laughter filled the apartment, making everything feel more personal. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I found myself thinking about Zaid again. I replayed our conversations in my mind, the way his laughter made my chest tighten, the way his presence seemed to fill the entire apartment. Well, I'm glad I can be good company, he said softly, and I turned away, blushing. It was silly, I told myself, because Zaid was young, full of life, and full of potential. He probably didn't even notice how I seemed to listen to everything he said. The following day, Zaid offered to make dinner. It's the least I can do after everything you've done for me, he said with a smile, and I accepted, intrigued to see him in the kitchen. He moved with such ease, his hands quick and sure as he chopped vegetables and stirred spices into a fragrant pot of stew. I tried to tell myself, but a tiny part of me knew better. It comes naturally to you, I said, leaning against the counter, and watching him, he glanced over his shoulder, his smile. Playful, my mom taught me, well, he said, but I'm sure I could still learn a thing or two from you. The way he looked at me in that moment, his eyes warm and steady, his smile lingering just a little too long, made my breath catch. I quickly turned away, focusing on setting the table, but my hands trembled as I worked that evening. As we sat down to eat, the atmosphere between us felt different. There was an unspoken tension, a quiet pull that neither of us spoke about, but both seemed to feel his gaze linger on mine a little longer than necessary. And I found myself watching the way his hands moved, noticing the strength in his fingers as he passed me the breadbasket after dinner. As I washed the dishes, Zaid came up beside me, his presence so close that I could feel the warmth coming from. Let me help him, he said. Reaching for the towel, I hesitated but nodded, unable to find the right words. The air between us felt charged, as if something unspoken hung in the air as his man lightly brushed mine while drying a plate. I felt a spark of electricity between us, catching me off guard for the rest of the evening. I kept my distance, avoiding his gaze, unsure of how to understand the flutter in my chest. When he said good night, his voice calm but warm, I couldn't help but glance up. Our eyes met briefly, and in that brief moment time seemed to stand still, leaving me unsettled by the quiet intimacy of it all. That night, as I laying in bed, my thoughts wouldn't calm. Zaid was a guest in our home, my husband's family, and much younger than me. Yet there was something unspoken between us, an undercurrent neither of us had named. I tried to reason with myself, telling myself that these feelings were temporarily misplaced and best ignored. But as the hours passed and the rain tapped softly against the window, I couldn't help but wonder why it felt so hard to let go. The storm outside grew stronger, the raindrops hitting the glass with a steady rhythm that matched the confusion and longing inside me. When Zaid stepped closer, his presence filled the space. His warmth is still noticeable in the cool air. I could smell the faint trace of his cologne, fresh and subtle, mixing with his natural scent. My breath quickened, and my heart raced, though neither of us spoke. Layla, he said, his voice low and steady, cutting through the sound of the rain. His hand hovered near mine before lightly brushing my arm. The gentle touch carried weight, a quiet question waiting for me to answer. If you want me to leave, just say so. I opened my mouth, knowing what I should say, but nothing came out. My heart pounded, and I instinctively shook my head, a silent denial. I didn't know what to say. I don't know, I whispered, the words filled with hesitation. That was all it took. Zaid stepped forward, his movements slow and calmly closing the space between us, his arms wrapped around me in a firm but careful embrace. He held me like I was fragile and strong. At the same time, his touch was respectful, yet filled with something deeper, unspoken. When his lips met mine, the kiss was soft at first, hesitant, testing boundaries. Neither of us had defined. His hand rested gently on the curve of my back, as if asking for reassurance. Wondering if this was what I truly wanted, I leaned to him, my body responding despite the doubts that still lingered in my mind. The intensity grew, a quiet urgency building between us. The rain outside blurred the world beyond the windows, wrapping us in the stillness of the moment. His presence was undeniable. Every movement he made was careful, not rushed, each touch full of understanding, not impulse. Zaid didn't overwhelm me. Instead, he steadied me, drawing me into a moment that felt both brief and deep, as though nothing else mattered outside the quiet storm we were in. Layla, no, he murmured against my lips, his voice full of emotion. You're beautiful. You have no idea how much I wanted this. His words sparked something inside me, a fire that burned away years of routine and monotony. I felt his hand move to my hip, gripping me firmly, but not harshly, his touch full of intent. My knees weakened, and before I could think, he gently guided me back toward the couch, his movements sure and steady, Zayd, I whispered, my voice trembling as he leaned me back against the cushions. I've got you, he said, his tone both comforting and hungry. His hands cradled my face, his thumbs brushing against my cheeks. His gaze was intense, almost too much to bear, but I couldn't look away. He leaned over me, his body pressing against mine, his hands framing my shoulders, as if to keep me in place. His weight felt both comforting and overwhelming reminder of the sharp difference between his youth and the quiet life I was used to. His lips moved from my mouth to my jaw, kissing me slowly and carefully, each kiss leaving warmth in its wake. His hands moved with purpose, sliding down my arms and sides, finally resting on my. He pulled me closer, his grip firm as though he didn't want to let go. You're incredible, he whispered, his voice thick with desire. I can't believe this is happening. Neither could I, but as his hands moved with more confidence and his body pressed closer to mine, all the reasons this was wrong faded away. He made me feel wanted, alive, and valued in a manner I hadn't felt in years, and I was engrossed in the moment. I whispered, "You're safe with me." As he shifted slightly, his movements smooth and controlled, as if every action was meant to show me how deeply he cared. His hands framed my face again, tilting it up as his lips claimed mine once more, the kiss deepening, and all I could feel was him, Zayd. My hands instinctively gripped his shoulders, as though to hold on to myself. His strength beneath my fingers was unquestionably a sign of his youth and vitality, which only intensified the moment. In that moment, when the world was forgotten and there was a storm outside, I believed him, even though neither Layla nor I had promised. By the time the storm outside subsided, we were tangled together on the couch, the quiet hum of the apartment wrapped around us like a cocoon, his hand resting on mine, tracing lazy patterns on my skin, his gaze soft and filled with contentment that matched mine. I allowed myself to give in completely, and his hands guided me with gentle yet determined movements, as though he wanted me to feel every ounce of his affection. Time blurred, minutes stretching into hours as we explored our connection. Every touch, kiss, and whispered word felt like a new discovery, tearing away the walls of restraint and hesitation that had defined my life for so long. "Are you all right?" he inquired in a voice that was just audible above a whisper, and I nodded, unable to put into words the rush of feelings that was inside of me. "I'm more than okay," I responded, my voice trembling but firm. "You're amazing, Lulaire," he added with a smile as he moved his hand to brush my cheek. For the first time in years, I felt genuinely seen and understood, but when the truth of what had just transpired set in, I hoped you knew that the sincerity in his comments made my chest hurt. For the time being, I couldn't ignore the weight of what lay ahead, but I allowed myself to enjoy the warmth of his presence before the world returned. The following morning, after the storm, the apartment felt quieter than usual. The rain had stopped, and the streets were shining under a pale Seattle sun. I stood by the window with a cup of tea, watching the city wake up. Zayd was still asleep in the guest room, and the events of the previous night kept replaying in my mind, each moment vivid and full of emotion. I touched my lips absent-mindedly, as if to make sure it had all been real. However, the morning brought with it a quiet sense of reality that what had happened between me and Rashid was undeniable, but it was also something that couldn't last my life with Rashid. Our shared history, my role as a wife, and my role as a mother and wife were all still there, unchanged, waiting for me to return. Zayd's voice stunned me deeply since I was so engrossed in my thoughts. "Good morning, Andy." Zayd's voice was kind as always, he said, but his expression felt much too intimate for such a formal greeting. I turned to see him standing in the doorway, his hair disheveled and his face soft but unsure. He was dressed simply in sweatpants and a t-shirt, but the sight of him made my heart hurt. I couldn't help but smile, unable to conceal the warmth that was rising in my chest. "Good morning," I replied, my voice softer than I meant. He crossed the room and stood beside me. His presence was steady and calming. For a moment, we didn't speak. We just stood there together watching the world outside the window last night. He began, his voice low and seriously. It meant everything to me. His words hung in the air, heavy with emotion. I turned to look at him, and the sincerity in his eyes nearly broke me. It meant a lot to me, too. I admitted, my voice shaking. But Zaid, we can't. Pretend this isn't complicated. I know, he said, his eyes still on mine, but I don't regret it. Do you? The question surprised me, and for a moment I didn't know how to respond. Regret wasn't the right word for what I felt had happened between us. Was beautiful, but it was also fleeting, something that couldn't continue beyond these walls. I don't regret it, I finally said, my voice barely a whisper. But I don't know how to move forward from here. Zaid reached out, brushing his hand lightly against mine. The touch was soft, unsure, but it sent a warm feeling through me. I don't want to make things harder for you, he said gently. His words seemed like a heavy burden, and I realized that even though I had known from the beginning that Zaid's stay in Seattle would be brief and that he would go once his business was over, hearing him say it out gave a sense of reality that I had never experienced before. When do you leave? The remainder of the day went by quickly. I said, my voice breaking. Tomorrow. He replied, I have to catch a flight back to Chicago in the evening, in a regretful tone. I nodded, feeling a tightening in my chest as the word tomorrow seemed like a ticking clock, a countdown to something I wasn't ready to end. Zaid and I moved around each other carefully, our conversations light and casual, as if we were both trying to keep up the appearance of normality, but every glance, every accidental touch carried a silent emotion we both couldn't ignore. That evening, when we sat down for dinner, the atmosphere between us felt heavy with things left unsaid. I had made one of Zaid's favorite dishes as lentil stew he had mentioned missing from his childhood, but the food mostly sat untouched on our plates. You've been so kind to me, Auntie, he said, suddenly breaking the silence. I don't think I've ever felt as welcome anywhere as I have here. I smiled, though it felt bittersweet. You've been wonderful company, Zaid. It's been a long time since this apartment has felt so alive. His gaze softened, and for a moment I thought he might reach for my hand, but he didn't. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. I'll miss you, he said quietly. The simplicity of his words brought tears to my eyes. I'll miss you too, I replied, my voice trembling. After dinner, we stayed in the living room, neither of us ready to say goodnight. There was tension between us, but it was mixed with a sadness that hadn't been there before. Zaid, I said finally, my voice breaking the silence. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, he replied, his voice calm but gentle. I just want you to know how much you mean to me. I looked at him, my heart aching. You mean a lot to me too, more than I could put into words. He smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. Then let's not ruin it with words. But we sat together in silence. After that, the quiet of the apartment wrapping around us like a cocoon, I wanted to reach out to him, to hold him just a little longer, but I knew that doing so would only make it harder. When he left the next morning, I helped him pack. The act was simple, almost boring, but it felt heavy, like each item he folded into his suitcase was a goodbye. Each one fell to like a piece of him I would never get back. When it was time for him to leave, he stood by the door with his bag on his shoulder. Thank you for everything, Annie, he said, his voice full of emotion. Take care of yourself, Z, I answered, my voice trembling. He paused as though he wanted to say more, but instead he leaned in and kissed my cheek, his lips lingering for a second. After he left, the apartment felt eerily quiet, and the echoes of his presence seemed to linger in every corner. I stood by the window, staring at the street below as if I was waiting for him to return, but he didn't. In the days and weeks that followed, I tried to resume my usual activities: cooking, cleaning, praying, and waiting for Rashid to return from a seminar. But no matter how hard I tried to divert my mind, my thoughts kept returning to Zaid, his voice, his smile, and the way he made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. I knew our time together was over and that it could never be more than a memory, but even as I told myself to move on, I couldn't help but miss the connection we had shared, so I waited and waited for the ache to fade, for the memories to soften. But deep down, I knew a part of me would always miss him. A part of me would always carry the weight of what we shared for a brief moment. Zaid had reminded me of something I thought I had lost: the ability to feel deeply, to love fiercely, and to live fully. After Zaid left, the days returned to their usual routine: quiet mornings, afternoons, and evenings filled with the sound of Rashid's TV programs echoing through the apartment. But something inside me had changed. I couldn't ignore it, and I couldn't suppress. Zaid's departure had left an ache, a void I hadn't expected. But more than that, it had awakened a part of me I thought was long gone. I had spent years living for others, my husband, my children, and my community. But in those few days with Zaid, I had felt something just for me, a spark of life, of passion, of freedom. At first, I tried to bury the memories, to smother the fire that had been lit inside me. But the more I tried to return to my old routines, the more restless I became. Every time Rashid left for another seminar or conference, I found myself staring at the empty apartment. The silence is suffocating. Then it happened again. It started innocent. Recently had a conversation with a younger man at the mosque, new to the community. His name was Nadir, and he had a warm smile, a way of making people feel seen. He asked me for advice about life in Seattle, about adjusting to the city. I offered to help, just as I had with Zaid, but as our conversations grew longer and his glances lingered, before I knew it, I was standing too close, grinning too much, and accepting his invitations to go for coffee or a stroll in the park. It didn't take long for the lines to start to blur, and I experienced the same rush and the same sense of aliveness. Every interaction felt like a tiny rebellion against the life I had been leading, one of quiet compromise and waning passions with Nader and others who came after, where I stepped into a world I had never allowed myself to imagine, a world where I was more than just a wife, mother, or housewife, and it wasn't about replacing Zaid. In the quiet places he left behind, I discovered a side of myself I hadn't seen in years. The guilt came in waves, rising and falling with every day. I prayed for forgiveness, clarity, and strength, but I couldn't stop myself. Every new connection and intimate moment reminded me of what it is meant to be seen, as desired, to feel alive. Rashid remained unaware, his attention always elsewhere, on his seminars, books, and endless TV shows. This couldn't go on forever, I realized. For the first time in years, I wasn't just existing, I was living, and no matter what the future brought, I knew I could never return to the woman I had been before. Secrets have a way of catching up with you, and the double life I had started to lead was delicate, balanced on the edge of discovery. But for the time being, in the quiet moments between the chaos, I allowed myself to enjoy the freedom, the thrill, and the connection I thought I would never feel again.